Welcome, everybody. This is the Strategic Planning in Times of VUCA webinar. We're excited to be here today as we close up the fourth quarter and head into the next quarter. It's a great time to be putting in place your strategic plans for next year or setting the times when you're going to do that and deciding how you're going to gather people. So this training is designed to support you as you begin to um, set the agenda and figure out when you're going to do strategic planning with your team. We think about strategic planning as an opportunity to set the direction and really lay out the path to outcomes. So we can think of that as a bit of our compass and our trail map. Where are we heading, and what are the outcomes going to be that we're aiming for? So the thing with doing any kind of planning in these times is we've got a lot more disturbances. We have these changes that are happening in technology. We've got environmental changes. We've got large social changes. And all of that, our organizations are really reorging themselves and trying to find the best fit for the organizational structure in these times. In order to be really effective, we need to learn how to incorporate those disturbances into our planning because we really find ourselves in this time of VUCA. VUCA is a term that the military coined to describe times of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So these moments where there's rapid and large changes, we don't know what's going to happen, there's many factors working together, and there's a state of like unknownness or things we can't measure. And we find that this used to be a special occasion, something that happened in war zones and times of natural disasters. But now, as our climate becomes more unstable and our economics more entwined, we find that we're really living in a whole era of VUCA. We love this quote that says, "Our age of anxiety is in great part the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools and yesterday's concepts." So we're finding that there's anxiety really up and down the organization, that we're all living with this increased sense of fear and general anxiousness. And a lot of that is that we just don't have the tools or the right concepts for dealing with this age of intense change. And so we really need to be finding new ways because as we're going into our strategic planning, we find that really 90% of organizations fail to execute on their strategies successfully. And that's just an enormous number. And so we really want to set your team and your organization up to win, up to find a way to deliver on the strategies that you set forth at the beginning of the year. So let's take a look at the various reasons for these failures. So we fail because it's really not safe to determine that or declare that this strategy is not a good strategy or has some hidden flaws. We fight over the things that are chosen or not chosen. We fight over priorities rather than aligning. Sometimes things fail because they're determined kind of way up at the top and then expected to be implemented by people at the bottom who had no say in the strategy or priorities chosen. We fail because they're kind of announced, but they're not integrated. Um, Many times our strategies are made for the organization, but they're really disconnected from the entire ecosystem that we're playing in. So it's just really no longer acceptable to be saying, okay, we as an organization are going to do this, but not taking into account how our partners and our competitors are really evolving the marketplace around us. And then other things that happen is we just find ourselves moving from emergency to emergency and ignoring the long-term strategy. And then finally, we have core cultural issues like lack of accountability and having our idea of strategy really be separated and not tied to concrete action. And so the way we're going to look at strategic planning today is really designed to integrate all of these things. So when we think about planning, and this can be for your team, for your organization, or really for any initiative, we root it in these four pillars: purpose, vision, portfolio, and progress. These concepts are going to be familiar to you under various names, but let's go through them and explore some of the distinctions that we make. So, starting with purpose. We think of purpose as something that has personal meaning and impact. So it's not enough to say we're gonna like save the world, which may have meaning to you, but really doesn't declare the measurable change that we're going to be able to see in a specific area. When we have a sense of aligned purpose, not only does that give us a direction to our work, but it also develops for each of us intrinsic motivation. If you think about things you're excited to show up for in the day, it's not just because they're important to somebody else, it's because they're important to you. And when our personal purpose is aligned with our organizational purpose, we find that we've got that motivation and that renewable source of energy to show up despite the various consequences that we might face. And so when a whole team is coming with that renewable energy, we have the capacity for sustainable growth. Even as we hit the next challenge and the next growth hurdle, we have as a team the energy and the capacity to meet those challenges. But the other really important thing that purpose brings for us is aligned autonomous action. So when we all know the direction we're going, we can work independently to get there. We don't have to be checking in at every moment or signing off on every small detail. We can actually just take action independently toward that common goal. As we evolve into this age of greater purpose and meaning in our work, we like to think about how we want our purpose to be evolving. In the past, the purpose of the organization was really rooted in its capacity to deliver shareholder value. And over the last several decades, we've moved to this idea that the business is also here to create value for the planet and for society. But we really believe that we're moving to this time where business and what it's creating is generating positive impacts on society and the planet because of how it's set up. It's not just part of what it's doing, it's that larger purpose that it's reaching for. So that really what we're aiming for is a purpose deeply rooted in regenerating the capacity of society to tend for it to tend to itself and for the planet to continuously be regenerating ecosystem resources. So vision is sometimes just given as like just a few details on a page or a few numbers on a page, but the power of vision is really in its ability to connect to the emotion. Um, if we really write our visions from this emotionally connected place that's happening sometime in the future that we can all see and really feel into, the path of how we're going to get there will open up as we move toward that vision. Because we think of the role of emotion as to set us in motion, the vision is actually the emotional connection that pulls the whole team forward. So, what's the time frame you should be thinking about your visions? So, in the past, people were taught to think about strategic plans being on kind of this 3 year or 5 year time horizon. And what we found is that really in this time, things are changing so very quickly that you need a 6 month concrete plan and a 10-year vision that really incorporates as much of the drastic changes you can see are going to happen in your products and services and your customer base and the world around you. And so having that far off future vision that's really allowing you to take in all of the change vectors that are going to account for the changes in your business model and then a really concrete plan that's very, very tight in because anything more than 6 months fails to incorporate changes we can't yet see.
So if you look at your vision, and once you have a clear idea of your vision, then you can actually dissect it down into your portfolio. Right? And your portfolio is ultimately clearly defined outcomes. Right? And depending on which level you're planning on, whether you're planning on a top level corporate or to project level, these might either be initiatives, right, entire tracks of actual strategies towards achieving an outcome, or they might actually be very concrete milestones. Right? So they might actually say, in order to get to this vision in 6 months, these are the 5, 6, 7 primary milestones that need to be hit. And the key here is to make really sure that you can define it as a clear outcome that then leads you to the next thing, which is really the progress indicators, right? You want to have clear measures to let you know that you're on the right path. And there's a bit of a difference between a goal and a progress indicator, right? A goal is something that is set that at the end of it you will reach, and yes, either you reached it or you didn't reach it, right? Versus a progress indicator, which is really there to let you know along the way if you're moving in the right direction, right? Because you might hit or miss a target, but why wait 6 months to find out if you hit or miss? Instead, go ahead and actually have something that allows you to measure so that as you go along the path, you have a constant ability to check in and see, are you moving towards your vision? Are you moving towards what you stated as your purpose?
So how can we think about the actual setup of the session that we're going to have for strategic planning? Because this is really where we can make the biggest difference. Those 4 pillars are very similar to most strategic planning formats that you've already seen. But how you approach the session can make the biggest difference between whether we have something that's really inclusive and everybody's bought into, or something that people may have just kind of passively agreed to, but didn't really feel bought in with. So, thinking about setting up your session, you want to make sure that you've got the relevant stakeholders. Nothing's worse than leaving out people who felt like they belonged there or really needed to be there in order to have a complete set of stakeholders. So really make sure you've got the relevant people there. Next, thinking about having good dedicated time. So this is time when people are not going to be coming in and out, when they're not going to need to be answering their phones, and giving people the time and space that they need to be focused on developing the strategic plan. And so that means like that somebody else is able to handle their calls and all emergencies are being tended to outside the room. We like to put people in a place with a neutral ground and ideally with a view. So if you think about gathering to do the strategic plan in kind of the boss's office, you're already going to be in a kind of an environment that's going to lend itself to the boss, if you will, getting his way. So finding a place where everybody feels included and safe, ideally someplace off-site, but the more neutral the place, the better. And finally, we've really found that your largest costs with any strategic planning session are going to be the dedicated time from your staff. So if you think about everybody who's in the room, their like salaries and the lost work that they could have been doing is really your largest cost for any strategic planning session. And so spending the extra money to have somebody to professionally facilitate it and ensure that everybody's voice is heard and we stay on track and use the time most efficiently is really just a wise use of your time and resources. Once we're in the session, we use our general meeting format. And so this is the framework that we use for all meetings, but is especially important in these kind of high stakes, high value meetings. And that's connect, scan, focus, act. So let's take a look at connect. Connect is the part of our meetings that are really the difference that makes the difference. It's that place where we begin to set up the kind of I other relationship. Instead of seeing each other as cogs in a wheel, we actually get in the room and begin to see each other as full humans with hopes and dreams and fears. And then we take the time, and especially in these strategic planning meetings, to connect to purpose. So that's the purpose of the organization, the purpose of the meeting. and if you have the time, even each other's individual purpose. And then you want to move on to connecting to vision. And so it's important to do this for the team that you're bringing in, but also lightly for each individual. So before we actually move into the part where we're really defining specific strategies, having that clear vision of the future that we're moving toward will support everything else in going um, more quickly, but also the priorities will begin to sort themselves out rather than needing to have a lot of discussion. So, as we kind of move into that space, really assess beforehand. Are we going to set up the container, and have we already set up the container where it's safe to disagree? Is your team avoiding conflict? And do you, as a leader, know how you make things suck? Do you know how you create chaos inside a meeting or how you tend to derail a meeting? And so finding a way for you as the leader to show up in such a way that people around you are going to feel safe to disagree with you, and that there's like some safe patternings for dealing with conflict and not just avoiding it.
And as a next phase, once you actually connected and you have a safe container in which people can really relate to each other, you want to go look into as big of a picture as you can get. Before jumping into solutions, really look at what is the entire landscape here, right? What are, first of all, is your strategic priorities, right? Because you are a company, you have a particular core proposition that fits with you and where you would want to go, kind of derived from your purpose as well. And then looking at trends, right? What can you all see out there? Right, and again, bring in things that it might even see disparate, like, for example, cultural trends that are affecting how your customers live their lives. Then look at ecosystem. And as I mentioned it already, how important it is to really look at what's happening in your ecosystem around you. What are your competitors doing? What are your vendors doing? What startups might be in your space? And continue to gather all of this information and look at opportunities. Right, this can come especially ideally from your front lines of innovation, right, from the salespeople, the marketing people, the people that are actually working with your customers every day, and ideally throughout your entire organization if you empower your people to really identify and act on opportunities. So to create a whole collection here of opportunities, even down to hunches, right? Some of these things can come in where somebody might just feel like something. And so at this point, it's not about judging or sorting out anything. At this point, it's really about scanning, going as wide as possible, so that you have also a whole bunch of experiments you can now run in the next 6 months to test what actually could work and how could you test things, right? So how could you test some of those assumptions that are underlying these items in your scan? So the key here being is that after you're connected, you really want to go as wide as possible without any judgment, so that then in the next phase, when you focus, you can bring it back down and you can really collect from the material, aggregate it, and think about what are really the outcomes that you want to commit to creating, right? What are some of the strategies for these outcomes? What are the things you need to do? What are some of the major things you need to set in motion to generate those outcomes? And one thing that people don't necessarily think about as much is, who do you need to be for that? Not just as an individual, of course, but as an organization, as a team, as an individual. Who do you need to be? What's your identity behind that? What's the kind of person that would create these strategies, right, and would actually succeed in it? Because the whole point of planning and strategy is to stretch yourself, right, to expand beyond where you're at today. So as you commit and focus on these different outcomes and strategies, you're also going to have to transform as who you are, again, as an individual, as a team, department, or entire enterprise. And finally, the other thing is to think about what do you need in order to make that happen, right? If you want to create these outcomes and you have these particular strategies that will get you there, you're going to have to become this kind of person. What will support you in doing that, right? Both in terms of practical support around creating outcomes, as well as also, down to the emotional support you might need. And you do all that before you act.
So, heading into the act phase, um, We really want to set up our actions around our quarter 1 priorities, our clear next, and our clear next steps. The other thing to really think about as we're moving into ACT is how we're creating commitments and how we're setting up our accountability. So I like to talk about accountability as the terms we often use for it, which is held accountable. So the first part of that term is held. We can't expect people to be accountable to outcomes that they are not set up to actually achieve. They need to be held in a system that's set up for success. And so that's simply, do we have a path to keeping track of our commitments? Do we have a system that enables us um, to show and decide what we're committed to and what we're moving forward with? Um, does the person have all the resources that they need? Do they have the skills and the human resources that they're going to need to deliver on those accountabilities? And then finally, do we have the tools, the um, conversations, and the capacity as a team to manage what happens when we miss or break an accountability? And so when something doesn't happen, can we have a meaningful conversation that forwards trust rather than builds up shame? And so these are just clear conversations about what was missed and how we're going to begin to learn to rely on each other again, and what happened that something was missed. Because if we're not setting those things up, then even as we create accountability, we're actually setting up fear and dread for people. If they don't feel like they've got everything they need to hit their targets and they don't have the capacity to clean up if they do miss something. But this act piece, rather than just coming out with priorities and like, okay, you do this, you do that, great. But are we actually able to get that into a system and break it down into small, clear next steps that people can actually begin to build momentum on? And that's the final and possibly most important piece of the whole game. That's what we've got for today, folks. There's a few of you on the line, and we really wanted to take the time to be able to answer questions. If you've got a question, please know that somebody else would really benefit from hearing what you're working with. Inevitably, the learning that happens between people on a webinar is sometimes more important than anything we could provide you. So do feel free to come off the line.
I have a question, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. So I love what you presented. I have a question about sort of managing up, if you will. So our team does all of this internally, and we can create that alignment within our team, but then seem to struggle a lot when it comes to getting our CEO or our management above us bought into it. And there seems to be a switch, and like if he's not totally bought in, he'll sort of throw it out the window and be like, your new target is X and it's based on nothing, and then it sort of creates this negative fear-based dread that you just talked about, which is those goals aren't really rooted in data or meaning, and we don't have the confidence in it. So how do you deal with that split between the team coming up with the strategy and then presenting it to some higher level management?
That's a great one. So since this has happened before, it might be useful to start with kind of just a very honest conversation ahead of time with, hey, in the past, our goals and our strategic plans haven't been met with enthusiasm by you. Would you like to join in our day? Or is there insight that you want us to be taking into account once, before we head into this day, so that there's some ability to get some information ahead of time? And then the other thing I'd add is, actually letting them know that, hey, when you just reject a plan that we've worked on and bring it back, it's really demoralizing for the team. So how can we find a way to include your ideas and information ahead of time? And all of that's a bit scary, but finding a way to really gently, without blame, letting people know their impact on the team around them and inviting them to provide their feedback ahead of time might support that. Philip, would you add anything there?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You want to see, I mean, when I said earlier in the scan, talking about the different strategic priorities to include here, right? These are coming from the executive team, right? So to really, outside of the clearing conversation, which Teresa mentioned, which I think is a great idea, beyond that, you want to have that as part of your what guides you, right? And for example, in Salesforce, they have a system where it trickles down all the way, where each individual knows exactly how their work connects to the goals that are reached above. But we see that a lot, especially in innovation, where on the very top people talk about certain goals, and the bottom people talk about certain goals, and in the middle, that sort of gets lost in the translation layer. So to really make sure that you go in and understand from the get-go what are their goals and how can your strategies support them.
Okay, thanks guys.